Okay, thanks so much for joining. This webinar is discussing exploratory testing. This is one of the new features we've added to SpiraTeam version 5.3. So for today's agenda, we'll be going through, first of all, an overview of exploratory testing at a high level, what that means, and how is it different from regular functional testing or regression testing. We'll then be demonstrating inside SpiraTeam some of the new features we've added specifically for exploratory testing. We're going to be using the new test case type, creating and running an exploratory test, recording the results, and doing on-the-fly editing. We'll also be logging some tasks and reviewing the tasks, and then at the end we'll have time for questions. So the first thing, exploratory testing is different to the other kinds of testing we've already supported in SpiraTeam. So the first thing is, in a traditional test case, you write the test case, you write the steps, you review it using the workflow, and then you basically assign the tests to people to run. They follow the steps in a prescriptive fashion, and then when the steps are all done, either they will all pass, or there are some issues and defects are logged. The developers will fix the defects, and then ultimately when all the defects are fixed and all the tests pass, you're ready to release the software. Now, exploratory testing is a bit different. Exploratory testing is really useful where you have requirements that maybe aren't yet quite finished, you're in the beginning of a sprint, and you want some feedback for the developers that are early, or you are doing other kinds of testing, but you're worried you might be missing things that you haven't been able to write down. You don't know what you're not able to find yet. And so there's great value in having someone do exploratory testing and find all those edge cases that didn't make it into the test cases, especially when time is short. So when you actually write an exploratory test, typically all you're doing up front is putting down what are called the aims or the charter, or just the objectives of what that session will be about. So it might be, we're going to explore the new login section of the website, for example. How does it work? You then, as a tester, manage that session. So you'll say, I'm going to spend 1 to 2 hours doing the testing, exploring that section of the application, logging my findings, and I'm going to try and record what I did, and I'm going to record what happened. And then I will use that to communicate to the developers, who will then review that with me and will then make changes. And I say communicate the feedback because at this point it may not be a defect yet. And so unlike a traditional test where we're going to log a defect, we want to let the developer explore what we found and then work with us to figure out, is it a bug? Is it working as designed? Is the design wrong? Because at this point we don't necessarily know, because we don't have steps to which to compare it against. So that's the different process that we have to deal with exploratory testing. And so where does SpiraTeam 5.3 come in? Well, if you look at those different steps, there are tools already on the market that do screen capture, video capture, browser plugins. There's a whole bunch of them out there, and they're really good at what they do. But when we looked at what the market doesn't really have, we found there were some gaps that we felt SpiraTeam could really fill in for. So the first thing is, in the current version of SpiraTeam, or the previous version at least, you didn't have the ability to edit steps on the fly. So that was an obvious impediment to exploratory testing. You couldn't rewrite the test case as you're going. So you either had to write a test case with one very vague step and put everything into the actual result, or you had to have some series of very general steps, neither of which really made sense. We do have the ability originally to capture the response and the actual result in the screenshots, but now we need a way to also edit the expected result and the screenshots in the test case as well as the test result at the same time. And the other big piece is, how do we communicate with our developers? Well, SpiraTeam has some great tools for doing that already. We have the ability to, I'm just going to mute someone, hold on. Thank you. So basically, you have the ability to communicate using the task management module. And so what we decided was, since we have that facility to log tasks, unlike an incident where a defect is something wrong with the system, a task is a great way to communicate that doesn't involve blame, it doesn't involve having to fix the solution. It's a way to communicate, because what we found was, when we run the tests and we actually have something that wasn't expected, the issue we run into is that, how do we track that? If we have a test that has 3 or 4 things that didn't work as expected, how do we track that one of them was correct, one of them was actually something wrong, and one of them is being discussed? When I run the test again, when I try exploring a second time, it'd be nice to know what action was taken on each of those. And so we decided it made sense to have a facility to provide that feedback, but not tie it to defects, because at this point there may not actually be bugs. I'm just getting a little noise on the phone. I'm just going to make sure everyone's muted. Hold on. Grid view, that's what I wanted. So if you're on the phone, I'm going to mute just to avoid the background noise. Okay, great. At the end, we'll have time for Q&A, so I'll unmute everyone then. Excellent. So those were some of the goals we had in the new version of SpiraTeam. It was to help run a test case in an ad hoc fashion and have a mechanism for communicating with the developers. So that's the overview. Now let's get into the system itself. So here is SpiraTeam, and I've actually taken the liberty of creating a new folder where we're going to put our test cases in, called Exploratory Testing. And what we'll do is create a new test case, and so far it's the same as you'll be familiar with. We create a test case, and by default it comes in as a new test case, owner, author, status, and so on. Now what we'll do though is we'll give it the name Exploring Login Page, and we'll mark it as ready for testing right away, and we'll change the type. And this is really important. There is a new type we added in version 5.3 called Exploratory Testing, and you must use that type. If you don't use that type, it will be run using the traditional standard test execution system, where you have the steps and you can log a defect, but that's it. So do make sure you have the exploratory type selected. Hit save. If you go into the test case just to look at it before we start running it, you'll notice that it has the name, which is Exploring the Login Page, and then we have a description. So in the description, that's where you'll put the charter or the aims. So we can describe in here, the aim of this test is to explore the new login page, check that it works as expected, and see if there are any issues so far. Now it's not necessarily finished. We don't yet know if this login page is fully working yet. There could be some issues, but we want to flush things out before it's finished. So you'll notice when we go further down, the test step is the single standard one, which is works as expected. And as a starting point, that's pretty good, because at this point, that's all we really know. I will assign it to myself. You don't have to do that. It's sysadmin, hit save. And so far, it's very similar to what you would do normally, except that the description is a bit more vague, and we only have one step. Normally, this wouldn't be ready for testing. We don't have enough written down. Now, the other thing is, with exploratory testing, unlike regular testing, you execute at the test case level, not the test set level. So when you're doing exploratory testing, you run one test case at a time. So that's another difference. And so when you hit the execute button, it's going to launch the testing wizard. And you'll notice you're in the exploratory mode, and you can tell that right from the URL line. It says test execute exploratory. And like we can before, we can choose the release. So we'll look at release 1.02. We could tell it things like the web browser. We can tell it the build. If we're using the build server, we can tell it the operating system. That hasn't changed. Same as before. Okay, so now we get into the test case. Now what has changed is that we have this little add button here, and we also don't have the different views. So if you remember before, we had the table view, the split view, and we still have those for regular test cases, but for exploratory tests, we've taken those views away. And what we do have, though, is this configuration option. If I click on the hamburger icon right here, I do have different options, and they're slightly different options to the ones we had in the regular testing. So one of the things I can do is turn off the sample data, which I think I'm going to do because we don't really need them right now. And I don't really use custom properties. I can show the last result, and that can be useful if you want to run a exploratory test a second time, because maybe the developers have changed something and you would like to compare the two. So that's an option. So we come in here, and the first test step was, new test case works as expected. Now, because it's an exploratory test, we can go in and we can start actually doing the testing, which is the login page. To avoid having to Alt-Tab, I'm not actually going to bring up an application to test. If you wanted to, you could use our library information system, www.libraryinformationsystem.org, and you could use that for your testing if you want to play around with it. But we'll just pretend I'm doing that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start doing some testing. So what I'll do is describe what I'm doing. So I'm going to go to the login page for the website. And the expected result would be it works as expected. That's fine. Or maybe I'll be a bit more explicit. The login page appears. And let's say we did that and it actually worked. We can even write at the same time, worked okay, and hit pass. Okay. Now, in a real test, we'd be done. But on exploratory testing, we can keep going because we can add a step. And we'll say in the next step, okay, we've got the login page. We're going to enter the login and password. Actually, I'm going to enter the correct login and password. And the expected result would be it logs me in, and I see the home page. Actual result would be works okay. I'll pass that one as well. So the next step would be, let's say we want to enter the incorrect login and password. And the expected result, I would think, would be I get a nice, friendly message saying the password is incorrect. Let's say I got something different though. I got a message saying the user doesn't exist. Now this might be for a good reason. This might be because from a security standpoint, we don't want them trying 100 logins and passwords because the password's incorrect. We might want a vague message that says the user doesn't exist, so they don't know if the user does exist or not from a security standpoint. Maybe that's what was intended, maybe not. And so as a tester, we haven't got this written down anywhere. The charter tells me I'm exploring, and so it's a good point at this point to, I think, mark it as a caution. I don't think it's failing, but it's not quite what I expected. And the problem now will be, how do I let the developer know? Because I can record this test result, but there's several passes, several cautions potentially as we keep going. He needs to know that something needs to be reviewed and discussed. So if we scroll down, we do see this new task area. Now you still can log incidents. So if you know something is truly broken, you can still click on the incidents tab, log a defect. That's still available even for an exploratory test. But in many cases, and in this case specifically, I don't actually want to log a defect yet because I don't know if it's a bug, and I want to fill up the system with thousands of defects that we have to close. So I'll go into the task section and I'll say, validation message on incorrect password seems too vague. Should we explicitly mention the password is wrong, or is that a security hole? And we'll assign that to a developer. We can assign that to, have a look, we'll assign it to Fred maybe. Okay. And we'll caution, that's good. We'll hit add. And we have a new task. We display it as a little story card right here, and that goes right into the system. It will go into Fred's My Page. Fred gets an email, and offline we can then discuss with Fred, what should we do about this? Is this truly something that's wrong? Is this something that we need to fix? Maybe the test is correct. But I've done my job. I've recorded the result of my observation. We've got an action item that we're going to refer to. Okay, so let's keep going. So another step, which would be enter in let's say a login and password with 99999 characters. The expected result would be the system accepts the data and either truncates it or handles it in some way. Again, I'm a tester. We haven't got a requirement written down in detail, but I would naturally expect that I should be able to put in lots of characters and it won't break. Let's pretend we get an actual result would be the system throws an exception and crashes the screen. Now I know this is not correct, so definitely that's a fail. And I might put a screenshot in, so I'll do a print screen. I'll just paste in my current screen, but you get the idea. You put in a screenshot. And if we scroll down, there's a screenshot. And I'll put that as a fail. Now, I could log a defect for this one, because this truly is something wrong, or I could add a task, and that's up to you, and some of this will depend where you are in the life cycle. So if we're at the end of a sprint and the system's pretty much in a good shape, you might want to log a defect, because this really is something that prevents release, and you don't want to have that go out as a bug, as a release. So a bug would mean stopping the release, it log as a defect, absolutely. Now we might be 1 week into the sprint, and maybe we've been told that the reality is the system is still very unstable, we're still making a lot of changes, the developers are still actively working on the system, and so we might get some system errors in edge cases. And in which case we don't want to log 1,000 defects yet, because we're going to find a lot of these type of strange issues where we haven't handled the data very well. So we might still want to log a task. So you still have the choice. You can go into the instance section or the task section. And in this case, since we pretend we're at the early phases of the release, we will log it as a task. So, major issue on the login page doesn't do length validation. And we'll assign that one. We can keep it to Fred, so we'll just do that and hit add. So we've got now a second task logged. Okay, so now we're done. In real life, we might carry on with more test cases and more steps, but you get the idea. Now, when we go to finish, what we can do is we can use the option here, finish, which we're familiar with from SpiraTeam before, but when we hit finish, we now have two options. In the old version of test running, or actually the traditional version of running a test, which is a regression test, a functional test, when you hit finish, you have one option, it records the result, and that's all. But with exploratory testing, we have edited the test case as well as the test run result. So we've actually changed the expected result, we've changed the actual result, we've added steps, we've made some major changes to the test case. Now, in some cases, we don't want to persist those changes. These were just for me for right now. I don't want to ever record those again. They were just me playing around with the system. I would hit just finish. In which case, we will log the failure, because the whole thing ultimately did fail. Each step's going to get a pass, a fail, and a caution in the result that's recorded as a test run. But that's it. The test case itself won't change. If I try running it again, it'll still be that single step saying it works. However, we do now have this new option, which would be, well, this is really a much better test case than what I started with, and if I do this again, I'm going to at least want to verify those same steps before I continue my exploration. I want to make sure that at least steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 pass. I may still add more steps later. So in which case, I would choose the option to update the test case. And when I do that, which I'll do right now, that's going to finish the test run. It's going to record the test run, so no change, but it's also going to update the test case. And that's a big difference from the traditional test cases in SpiraTeam. It lets you update the live test case as well as the test results. So if we go to test runs, we will see here we have our exploring test login page. Here's the run. The overall test run did fail. You will see if I scroll down my steps. So the first step passed, second step passed, third step was that caution because we got the message that was unclear, and the fourth one finished with the failure because that was clearly not a good result. That's good. Now I also can go to a new tab we've added called tasks, because traditionally you could always see which defects are related to this test result, or there aren't any. But I can also now see my two tasks. So I can then view that they are a task that were created and they've been assigned, and then what we will be able to do is, before we go and retest this, we can make sure before I retest this, I want these two tasks to be completed, because there's no point me doing it again unless something's been done on it. And that addresses one of the major themes we wanted to address with SpiraTeam Exploratory Testing was, how do I know as a tester what's changed? Because maybe they fixed the major validation issue with the thing throwing an exception, but the login page, we have to discuss that. What should we do? We have to talk to the security guy, because maybe we don't want to have a good message. Maybe it's deliberately vague, and that may take a few more days. So I would like to know as a tester, if I'm going to do another round of testing, what's changed, what should I just skip over and mark as NA? And before, we didn't have a really good way of doing that. We would typically record a test result, and I'd have to go through this test run, and I have to try and decipher, these are the 4 things. Maybe the bug was logged, maybe it wasn't. This is a caution. Ask the developer, did you actually fix this one yet? There wasn't a good way of knowing for sure. And if you're in a distributed team, well, it's very difficult. You might be waiting a day to find out. So now we've got a good way of communicating between the developer and the tester what changes have been made. So if I run the test again, I can know which pieces I need to look for, which pieces I can simply skip over. And maybe at this point, I decide I don't want to do any more exploring of this area. The developers have got some work to do. Let's wait and I'll explore somewhere else. The other thing is the test case. So if we go back to the test case, which is right here, Exploring Login page, it's marked as failed, which we would expect, no change there, and we still have the name and the aims, they haven't changed, but we do now have the steps. The actual steps that I used are now codified in the test case. So we now have a couple of thoughts. One is, let's say I want to give this to a traditional regression tester or functional tester, someone just to make sure it doesn't reoccur. I could change the type to a functional test, hit save, and now it's going to run with the normal test execution, but instead of having one very vague step, I've got 4 more detailed steps, enough that someone else could probably reproduce. Alternatively, I'm going to do some more exploration once those tasks are done, and in which case I'll keep it as an exploratory type, and I will probably retest those 4 steps, but I may add some more. So the great feature is you can use it to do exploratory testing, but those exploratory tests do become regular tests if you wish. Now, the one question that does obviously raise is, one thing people have asked for in the past is, I don't want to do exploratory testing, but I do want to change test cases on the fly because we've got a small team and we haven't got time to always edit them. You can, just simply have the exploratory type be a way of doing that. You could make your tests, in name only exploratory, and then you can edit them on the fly and actually have that inline editing, inline changing feature, and the ability to push the changes back to the live test case. So even for people who aren't doing actual exploratory testing, the new feature does give you the ability to edit them on the fly, which is really useful if you've got a team where test cases have gotten out of date and you don't want to have to go through and edit them all and then run them all. You want to do it all in one go. So that's a nice feature too. In terms of exploratory testing as a whole, this obviously doesn't address the specific parts around screen capture, recording. As I mentioned, there are some tools on the market, browser plugins and so on, that do that. We're also looking at adding some tools of our own, which would be separate add-ons to the browser that will integrate with SpiraTeam to do some of those other pieces as well. So we understand that this exploratory testing feature is really more for the communication, and it's for allowing you to edit the test cases on the fly and recording what happened, but we're also going to be developing some new tools which will be outside the browser, like a plugin or a desktop app, things that can actually do screen capture and actually let you record what's going on in real time. So that was an overview of the exploratory testing functionality for SpiraTeam. We will be having other webinars in the future on various other topics, so please keep an eye on our website on the events section for upcoming webinars,